My son told me I was just a burden. 3 weeks after I buried my husband, he looked me in the eye and said I should either get a job or get out of his house. I didn't cry. I didn't fight. I packed my bag and walked out into the cold March wind. I thought I had lost everything. But that day, I stepped into a house I hadn't seen in nearly 50 years, and inside it was a man who once asked me to be his wife. What came next? Even I could never have imagined. I buried my husband on a rainy Thursday. Cold mud clung to my shoes, and the priest's voice sounded more like a whisper than a prayer. 41 years together. That's how long Charles and I had built a life. Not perfect, not grand, but it was ours. And now it was gone, just like that. The following Monday, my son Bradley told me I needed to find a job. We were sitting in the kitchen, the smell of stale toast still lingering in the air. He didn't even look up from his phone when he said it. Just let the words drop, like they weren't meant to shake me to my core. He said, "You can't just sit around anymore. You're 70. You either start contributing or start packing." I kept staring at my cup of tea. My hands didn't shake. I didn't speak. I just listened to my only child draw a line in the sand like I was a tenant behind on rent. That was the moment something in me stopped. Or maybe it started. It's hard to tell. But it's clear now that everything changed in that breath. Let me be honest. I didn't expect a parade or a sympathy card every day. I didn't expect him to hold my hand through the grief. But I thought he would remember who I was. The woman who packed his lunches for 12 years straight, who sewed his Halloween costumes when money was tight, who stayed up waiting when he missed curfew but never yelled when he walked through the door. I gave him everything I had, and in return, I got a deadline to move out. He said it was time I stopped being emotional and started being practical. He mentioned my social security, said it was enough to get by, maybe rent a room somewhere. Said it like he had already planned it all out. Said it like I wasn't his mother, just a calculation. That night, I sat in the guest room surrounded by cardboard boxes and the leftover scent of my husband's cologne on my scarf. I remember thinking, so this is how it ends. Not with a scream, not even with a goodbye. Just with silence and a calendar date to be gone. I didn't tell anyone, not my sister, not my friend down the street. It was too embarrassing, too hollow, because once you say it out loud, it becomes real. 3 weeks. That's what he gave me. 3 weeks to turn my entire world into a suitcase. 3 weeks to erase the idea that I was ever a part of his home. And I took every second of it to remember everything I had done. Every birthday cake, every late-night drive, every hug that once meant something. By the time the final day came, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was something else. Empty, but awake. And sometimes that's the most dangerous thing a person can be. I stayed in the house for the next 2 weeks, keeping quiet, keeping busy. I made sure the kitchen was spotless before sunrise. I walked the kids to school, even when the snow turned slushy and grey. I folded laundry that wasn't mine, and cooked meals no one thanked me for. I didn't speak unless spoken to. I tried to become invisible, thinking maybe that would make me easier to keep. Melanie, my daughter-in-law, never raised her voice, but everything in her tone felt like a closed door. She didn't say anything cruel, not directly. It was always small things, moving her coffee mug away when I reached for it, sighing when I left a light on, rewashing a plate I had already cleaned, polite corrections that stacked on top of each other like bricks. And every day, she asked the same question with her eyes. Why are you still here? Bradley avoided me more than he spoke to me. He left early, came home late, and hardly looked in my direction. When he did, it was with that tight-lipped expression he got when the printer jammed or the cable cut out. like I was just another problem to fix. I tried to keep to my space. The guest room had once been my husband's study. The bookshelves were still there, lined with old Western novels he loved and never finished. The window looked out to the neighbour's oak tree, where squirrels chased each other like nothing had changed. But inside that room, I was slowly disappearing, not in body, in presence. One night I left a note on the fridge offering to make dinner for everyone, something warm, familiar. I spent the afternoon cooking my son's favourite stew. When it was done, I set the table, lit a candle, and waited. They ordered pizza. Melanie didn't even look up from her phone when she told me. Bradley said they were too tired for something heavy. My stew sat untouched. I poured it into containers, placed them neatly in the fridge, and wiped down the counters until they shined. The next morning, Melanie had tossed the containers, said there wasn't enough space. I nodded. I smiled. I took out the trash. That was the rhythm. I moved through their home like a shadow. I stayed useful. I stayed out of the way. I stayed until I could feel myself thinning at the edges. But I noticed something else. A folder left open on the kitchen counter one evening while they were upstairs bathing the kids. A few job listings. One of them circled in pen. Companion care. Elder support. Clean driving record required. Next to it, a sticky note in Bradley's handwriting. She needs to feel useful. No signature, no explanation. Just that one sentence, not even addressed to me. It was a reminder. Maybe for Melanie. Maybe for himself. I put the folder back where I found it and closed the drawer softly. In that moment, I understood. They weren't waiting for me to leave. They were preparing me to go. And I think part of me was starting to believe it too. The job interview was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp. Bradley handed me the printed address that morning, along with a set of keys and a quick reminder to be professional. He didn't ask if I was nervous. He didn't wish me luck, just told me not to be late and went back to his laptop. It was a quiet drive 30 minutes out of town. A long stretch of highway gave way to narrow roads lined with pine. The house sat back from the street, white with grey shutters, 2 stories well kept but quiet. No cars in the driveway, no motion at the windows, just stillness and the faint sound of wind through bare branches. I rang the doorbell once and waited. A few seconds later, the door opened slowly. The man who answered looked older than I expected. Thinner, too. His hair had turned nearly silver, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that hadn't faded. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was Terry Halverson. I hadn't heard that name spoken in nearly 5 decades, but I had never forgotten it. He had once stood outside my parents' porch with a ring in his hand and a backpack over his shoulder. He had asked me to leave town with him. I had said no. Now he stood in front of me again, but this time he didn't seem to recognize me at all. He greeted me with a short nod and turned back into the house without a word. I followed slowly, trying to steady my hands. The inside smelled faintly of cedar and old music books. A piano sat in the corner of the living room covered with a soft cloth. Dust gathered at the corners, but the place was far from neglected. Everything was neat, carefully placed, but cold. A woman in a maroon sweater stepped out from the hallway, mid-50s clipped tone clipboard in hand. She introduced herself as Vanessa, his part-time nurse. Explained that Mr. Halverson had suffered a mild stroke 2 years ago. Physically, he had recovered well. Mentally, things were slower. Short-term memory struggled. Old memories sometimes tangled. He needed company meals, prepared reminders for medication. Someone, quiet, patient, attentive. She asked if I could cook, drive lift a bag of groceries, manage a basic schedule. I said yes. My voice didn't shake, not even when Terry sat down at the piano, lifted the cloth and touched the keys without playing a note. Vanessa excused herself after the checklist, said she would speak with his legal guardian and be in touch by the end of the week. I walked out to my car in a daze. I didn't remember much of the drive back, just that my heart felt too loud, like it didn't belong inside my chest. At home, I didn't tell Bradley who it was. He asked how it went. I said fine. He nodded like he had already moved on. That night I lay in bed replaying every detail. The piano, the way he rubbed his temple before sitting down, the way he looked past me without seeing. I wondered what his days were like now, if he remembered composing songs at midnight, if he still drank his coffee black, if he ever thought about me the way I had thought about him. Terry Halverson, my almost. And now maybe my second beginning. I started the job the following Monday. Vanessa gave me a short orientation, handed me a schedule, and said she'd stop by twice a week to monitor his progress. Then she left. Just like that. No formal goodbye, no warm welcome, just the sound of her car pulling away and me standing in the hallway of a house I hadn't seen since I was 22. Terry was sitting by the window when I brought him his tea. He didn't look up, but he took the cup gently like it was something precious. His hands were thinner than I remembered, but still careful, still precise. He thanked me with a quiet nod. I didn't expect more than that. The first few days followed a rhythm. I arrived at 8, left at 4, made his breakfast, kept track of his medication and organized the mail and read the paper out loud while he listened with eyes half closed. Some afternoons he napped in the sunroom. Other times he sat at the piano and let his fingers rest on the keys without playing. He never asked me about my life, never asked my name, but every now and then he stared at me like there was something on the tip of his mind he couldn't quite grab. One afternoon I found him standing by the hallway closet, holding a coat that didn't belong to him. He looked confused, lost almost. I walked over slowly and helped him ease it back onto the hanger. I told him everything was okay. He let me guide him to his chair like I had done it 100 times before, and maybe in a different life I had. That night I sat in my room and pulled out an old box I had brought with me. Inside were a few things I had never shown my son. Letters, a photograph, a tiny music box shaped like a seashell. It had belonged to Terry. He gave it to me the week before I left town all those years ago. I hadn't opened it in decades. I wound it up slowly until the tune began, soft, barely there. The next morning I brought it with me. I didn't plan to show him, I just kept it in my bag. But around mid-morning I caught him humming, a tune I hadn't heard in 50 years, the exact same one. He stopped when he saw me staring, cleared his throat, asked for tea. I brought it in silence, placed it down, then sat across from him. I watched his hands, the way they cupped the porcelain, the way they rested on his lap as if waiting for something. And then in a voice that was rough but certain, he said my name. Joanne. Just that. No question. No hesitation. I didn't speak. I couldn't. His eyes stayed on mine, not confused, not lost, just steady. He didn't ask why I was there, didn't ask where I had been. He just said it again. Joanne. The way he used to when he would stand at the edge of a summer lake and call for me to jump in. I nodded once. That was all I could do. He smiled then, soft, like the kind that only comes after years of waiting. And he reached out, not to hold my hand, but just to let his fingers brush the back of mine. We sat like that for a long time. No questions, no explanations. Just the quiet recognition of two people who once belonged to each other, and maybe still did. That night, after Terry said my name for the second time, I drove home in silence. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, the kind that holds something in it. Something warm. like the last glow of sunlight before it disappears behind the hills. I couldn't sleep. I kept going over every moment in my head, the way he looked at me, the way he said my name like it had never left his mouth. I lay in bed listening to the wind tap gently against the window, thinking about the years between us. Not the kind you measure on a calendar, the kind you feel in your bones. The next morning, I didn't bring the music box. I didn't want to push anything. I just wanted to see what stayed with him overnight. He was quiet at breakfast, like usual, but when I set his teacup down, he glanced up and gave me a look that said he knew I was there. Not just as a caretaker, as someone he used to love. Around lunchtime, he asked if I could bring him the green box from the hallway closet. I found it tucked behind a stack of old scarves. It was heavier than it looked. Inside were photographs, letters, a few dried flowers, pressed between pages of a hymn book. I handed it to him and waited. He pulled out a picture, black and white, faded. It was me, 19, standing in front of the old theatre downtown, my hair pulled back, laughing at something he had just said. He held it for a long time, then passed it to me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Later that evening, I opened the drawer in my nightstand and took out a letter. I had carried it for years. Folded so many times the paper had softened. The envelope was never sealed. It was the last letter he wrote me. I never received it back then. My mother had intercepted it. She told me Terry had left town without saying goodbye, that he had found someone else. I believed her. I believed everything she said, because I thought parents didn't lie like that. But when my mother passed, I found the letter among her things, hidden in a stack of unpaid bills, still in its envelope, still addressed to me. In it, Terry had written that he wanted to stay, that he would wait if I needed time, that he had never stopped loving me. I had read that letter maybe 100 times. Each time it scraped something new inside me. I took it with me the next day. He was in the sunroom when I arrived, already awake, already dressed. The light made his silver hair look almost white. I sat beside him and handed him the letter without a word. He read it slowly, line by line, then looked up at me. He said nothing, just reached out and laid his hand over mine again. Not as a question, not as an apology, just presence. I felt tears rise, but I kept them quiet. For a long while we sat together in that silence. Not the same silence from before. This one felt different. This silence felt like forgiveness, like something heavy being put down. And somewhere in that moment, I realized it wasn't too late. Not for everything, but maybe for something. Something real. Something still alive. ChatGPT, Danoi. The first sign came in the mail. I was going through Terry's bills that afternoon, organizing statements, checking what had already been paid. A manila envelope had been slipped in among them, addressed to me, not Terry. No return label. The handwriting was unmistakable. Bradley's. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a pre-approval notice from a lending company. Highlighted in yellow was a figure I recognized too well, $72,000. A post-it was stuck to the bottom. It read, "Signed and processed." Except I hadn't signed anything. My hands stayed still, but my stomach turned. I flipped the page. There was my name, my address, my social security number. There was even a signature, slanted, neat, almost convincing. But it wasn't mine. I stared at it for a long time. Not in shock, not even in panic. I think something inside me had been waiting for this, a confirmation, something to match the cold I had been living in for months. I placed the paper gently back into the envelope and set it aside. Then I opened my own bank statements, accounts I hadn't looked at since Charles passed. savings that hadn't been touched in years, until now. 3 withdrawals, 2 in small amounts, 1 for over $30,000, all within the past 6 weeks, all logged from the same bank branch near Bradley's office. I sat back in the chair. The room felt too quiet, too clean. I looked around at Terry, still asleep in the other room, his chest rising and falling steady and slow, and I felt something click. I drove home early that evening. I didn't tell Terry why. I just kissed the top of his head and said I'd be back in the morning. Bradley wasn't home yet, but Melanie was. She greeted me without warmth. I told her I needed to grab a few papers from the cabinet. She didn't ask what kind. When I opened the bottom drawer, the one Bradley always kept locked, I found the rest of the puzzle. Mortgage papers, insurance forms. My name scattered across all of them, scrawled in ink that didn't belong to me. He had refinanced the house. Our house. The one Charles and I built from a patch of dirt and a dream. He had used it as collateral, and it was already in default. I took pictures of everything. Every form, every signature, every false address. I put the papers back exactly as I found them and walked out. That night I didn't cry. I sat in my car in the driveway and let the engine run while the windows fogged. The air felt heavy, but my mind was clear. Bradley had already decided what I was worth. He had measured me out in interest rates and payoff dates, but I still had something left. Something he hadn't calculated for. Myself. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to get a lawyer. And then I was going to get my life back. Quietly. On my own terms. The lawyer's office was quiet. Clean walls, soft carpet, a little clock ticking faintly behind the receptionist's desk. I sat across from a woman named Sandra Beck, mid-40s, sharp eyes, no small talk. She skimmed the copies I brought, flipped through the forged documents with a frown that grew deeper each page. When she finished, she looked up and said it was enough to open a full case. She explained the process, slow but solid. We'd need to file an affidavit confirming the signatures weren't mine, request forensic verification, freeze assets, if necessary. It would take time, but she assured me that time wasn't working in Bradley's favor. I signed the first form. My real signature this time, my hand steady. When I left the office, the wind felt different on my face, like it had finally cleared after weeks of rain. I didn't return home that night. I went back to Terry's and let myself in with the spare key Vanessa had given me. The house was dark, but he was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the morning paper unopened beside him. He looked at me like he'd been waiting. I told him I'd be staying a little longer than usual. He nodded once, then slid the paper across the table and asked me to read. Same as always, like nothing had changed. But something had. Over the next few days, I rearranged my schedule. I met with Sandra again, opened a new account in my name, filed change of address paperwork, and requested all future mail to be rerouted to a P.O. box near Terry's neighborhood. Quiet steps, no announcements. Melanie texted twice. The first asked if I was coming back to help with the kids. The second reminded me the electric bill was due. I didn't answer either. Bradley didn't call. I didn't expect him to. One morning, while sorting through the mail, I found a letter from the State Financial Board. An inquiry had been opened into the lending company that processed the forged documents. Sandra had filed a complaint on my behalf, and apparently I wasn't the first to report misuse of power of attorney. I folded the letter slowly and placed it in my bag. Later that week, I found a small envelope in Terry's drawer. It wasn't addressed, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. My mother's. Curved and exact. Inside was an old photo of me and Terry standing outside the county fair arms, rapt tight faces lit with sun and youth. She had kept it. All those years pretending like he never existed, she had kept it. I didn't feel angry, just quiet. Sometimes people bury what they envy. That night I brought the photo into the living room and showed it to Terry. He smiled slowly, like it reached the corners of his heart. Then he leaned back and said my name with a kind of softness I hadn't heard since we were 19. Joanne. No bitterness, no regret, just memory. After he went to bed, I sat alone by the piano and looked around the house. It was still unfamiliar in places, still not mine, but I felt safe. I felt present. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was building something again. Not from obligation, not for anyone else's approval, but from my own ground up, quietly, carefully, day by day. It was a Thursday afternoon when I made the final decision. I had just come back from Sandra's office with the last set of legal documents. We had reviewed everything: the forged signatures, the unauthorized withdrawals, the mortgage Bradley had taken out behind my back. She had prepared the motion to nullify the refinance and reclaim my financial authority. It was time to act. Back at Terry's, the house was quiet. The sun poured through the living room window, casting long patterns across the carpet. I made tea, sat at the dining table, and pulled out the envelope I had been adding to for weeks. Inside were copies of every document Sandra and I had filed, along with a letter I had written by hand. No accusations, no anger, just the facts. A mother explaining what her son had done to her and why she had no choice but to stop him. I sealed the envelope and set it aside. Then I walked into the den, opened Charles's old laptop, and logged into my joint accounts for the last time. I transferred the remaining balance to the new trust Sandra had helped me create. The name on the trust wasn't mine. It was simply titled The Merrick Fund for Women Starting Over. It wasn't large, but it was real. Enough to support a small group of women each year. Women who had nowhere else to go. Women like me. I had added Terry's name as co-founder, not because he asked, because I wanted someone beside me who knew what it meant to rebuild quietly. The next day, I returned to the house where Bradley and Melanie lived. It was late morning. The driveway was empty. I let myself in using the key I had never returned. Everything was still in its place. The furniture, the faint scent of cinnamon from the plug-in near the hallway, the framed school pictures of the kids on the wall. I stood in the foyer and took a deep breath. I didn't walk past the living room. I didn't go upstairs. I walked to the kitchen table and placed the envelope in the center. Then I took off my house key, laid it beside it, and turned to leave. I paused at the door. Just a second. Just long enough to feel the full weight of the moment. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was stepping away from something that had already let me go a long time ago. Back at Terry's, he was finishing lunch. He looked up as I walked in, gave a small smile, and patted the chair next to him. We didn't talk about where I had been. That evening, I sat on the porch and watched the sky turn from gold to blue. The quiet didn't feel like loneliness anymore. It felt like space. The kind you make when something ends. The kind you need when something new is about to begin. I had no interest in revenge. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted closure. Not for them. For me. I thought of Bradley and how he would react to the letter, whether he would deny it, whether he would feel anything at all. But then I let that thought go. It didn't belong to me anymore. What mattered was that I had spoken. I had moved. I had drawn the line, and it would hold. It was just after breakfast when Terry slid a small box across the table. He didn't say a word, just looked at me with that same calm steadiness I had come to know again, the one that never asked for anything, but always left room for everything. The box was dark wood, polished but simple. Inside was a ring, gold, delicate, with a single sapphire in the center. I recognized it immediately. It had belonged to his mother. I had seen it once when we were both still teenagers, back when marriage was something we whispered about under porch lights, not something we thought would circle back to us in our 70s. I picked it up and let the weight of it settle in my palm. He said only one thing. He told me there was no rush, that it didn't have to mean anything more than what we already were, but that if I wanted, we could share the rest of the days we had. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. I nodded once. That was all. The following week we married quietly at the courthouse. No flowers, no formal vows. Just the two of us, the judge, and one woman from the front office, who kindly agreed to take our photo. I wore a blue dress I found at the back of my closet. Terry wore a grey suit that didn't quite fit at the shoulders, but made him look proud. When we walked outside, the sky was overcast, but the air was soft. We held hands all the way back to the car. Back at the house, I made lunch while he sorted through a stack of music sheets he had kept over the years. He had started playing again. Not often, but enough. Sometimes just a phrase, sometimes a full piece. He told me he wanted to host something small, a gathering, nothing big, just people he trusted, and music. A few of his old students had stayed in touch. They had offered to help if he ever decided to play again. I agreed, quietly, happily. We set a date, sent out a few handwritten invitations, called it an evening recital. No fundraiser, no speeches, just music. I spent the following days preparing the house, polishing the piano, rearranging the chairs, setting out glasses for tea and sparkling cider. Terry practiced in the afternoons. I could hear the notes drifting through the rooms, sometimes shaky, sometimes strong. The day of the recital came, the house filled with soft voices and warm light. Terry played 3 pieces. One was a composition I had never heard before. When it ended, he looked at me, then at the room, and said the title. Joanne, in Spring. There was no applause, not right away, just stillness. Then one person clapped, then another, and soon the whole room was echoing with gentle hands. I stood in the corner watching, letting it all pass through me. Not pride, not surprise, just something fuller, something real. After everyone had gone, Terry and I sat on the couch with our shoes off and our legs stretched out. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. I had started this year feeling like a shadow, fading into the corners of a life I thought no longer had space for me. But here in this house, in this quiet, I had found a rhythm again. Not the same one I had before, but mine. The letter came 3 days after the recital, postmarked from our old neighborhood, no return address. Just my name, written in a handwriting I had known since the day I taught him how to hold a pencil. I opened it alone, standing by the kitchen sink. The paper was stiff, folded twice, ink pressed hard against the fibers, like the words had been written through clenched teeth. Bradley didn't apologize. He said he had seen the changes to the accounts. He said the lawyer had called him after receiving official notice of the fraud investigation. He said the mortgage company had frozen the property and he was being audited. He called it an overreaction. He said I had humiliated him. There was no mention of the money he had taken, no mention of the signature he had forged, no acknowledgement of the lies. He only said I had made things worse by involving strangers, that this was a family matter, that I should have come to him like a mother, not an accuser. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it again and slid it into a drawer without a label. I didn't feel angry, not in the way I used to, but something settled, a kind of finality. Later that afternoon, I took a slow walk to the mailbox. A soft wind moved through the trees and the sky held that late autumn blue that makes the edges of everything feel closer. There was a single envelope inside, a thank you card from one of Terry's former students. She had signed her name and included a photo of her with her daughter. In the background, I saw the edge of Terry's piano, the same one that now stood in our living room. I placed the card next to the music sheets he had left out and sat down to write my own letter. It was to Bradley, but it wasn't a response. It was the letter I had never written, the one I needed to. I told him I remembered the way he used to cry when he was scared of thunderstorms, how he would run into my room and climb under the blanket without asking. I reminded him of the time he broke his wrist on the school playground and begged me not to tell his father because he didn't want to look weak. I reminded him I never told. I told him I had loved him every day of his life, even on the days he made that love hard. But I also told him the truth, that love is not permission, that family is not ownership, that respect is not optional. I told him I was not disappearing. I was not being erased. I was choosing myself, quietly, deliberately. I didn't send the letter. I placed it in the same drawer as his, right on top. That evening, Terry made soup. We ate by the window, listening to the wind play across the glass. I watched the trees bend gently and return to stillness. I thought of all the years I had waited for permission to take up space, to speak, to hold my own line. Now I knew better. Some storms you don't hide from, some storms you walk through. And on the other side, the air always feels sharper, cleaner. You breathe in. You keep walking. Winter came soft that year. The snow arrived late, barely covering the yard by Christmas. But there was enough to hush the streets, to blanket the trees in a way that made everything feel slower. Terry liked to sit by the front window with a blanket across his knees, watching the sky shift from grey to white and back again. He had taken to composing again. Nothing too elaborate. Little things. A melody here, a few bars there. Sometimes he hummed while I read. Other times he simply tapped rhythms against the arm of the chair with his fingers. I knew better than to ask what he was working on. He would share when he was ready. I started volunteering at the local library twice a week. The mornings were quiet, mostly seniors who came in for audiobooks or to use the printer. There was something grounding about being around shelves of stories that had nothing to do with mine. I wasn't Joanne the widow, or Joanne the caretaker. I was just a woman who shelved returns and gave people directions to the history section. One afternoon, as I was checking the return bin, I found a familiar name on the spine of a book. It was one of Terry's old students, a woman who had gone on to publish 3 volumes of poetry and a memoir. I remembered the night she came to the recital. She had worn a yellow scarf and clapped with both hands above her head when Terry finished his last song. I placed the book on the new releases table with quiet pride. At home, Terry and I spent New Year's Eve with no countdown, no noise, just a pot of stew, an old jazz record spinning low, and the warmth of knowing the year behind us had been one neither of us had expected. He raised his glass halfway through dinner. He said it had been a long road. I agreed. He said he wished Charles could see me now, that he would be proud. I didn't respond right away. I just looked around the room, at the life we had quietly built. No declarations, no milestones, just days filled with presence. Later that week, I received a letter addressed to the Merrick Fund. It was from a woman in Ohio, early 60s, recently divorced. She had read about the foundation through a local newsletter. She wanted to know if it was real, if the application form on the website was active. She ended the letter by saying she wasn't looking for pity, just a place to begin again. I printed the form myself, wrote a note by hand, told her we were honored to have her apply, that starting again wasn't weakness, it was courage. I signed it with both our names. That night I sat with Terry by the fireplace. The air smelled of pine, the kind that lingers on coats and scarves. I thought about all the ways a life could shift without warning, how a woman could be pushed out of her own home and somehow find herself walking back into one where she was not only seen, but chosen. I thought about the line I had drawn, not to keep people out, but to keep myself in. Spring came quietly, no big announcements, just a slow warming, patches of green pushing through the frost, the sound of birds returning one by one. I found myself waking earlier each morning not out of duty, but out of ease. Terry's health held steady. He walked a little slower, paused more often, but his mind stayed sharp and his music grew fuller. He had begun composing again with purpose, one piece at a time. He said he wasn't chasing brilliance, he was just letting the years settle into notes. We took walks when the weather allowed, down quiet roads past houses with porches and tulips in bloom. People waved, some recognized him. Others smiled just because we looked peaceful together. I no longer felt the need to explain who I was or where I had come from. One afternoon, I returned home to find a package at the door. Inside was a printed copy of a small local paper. On the front page was a photo from the recital. Me and Terry side by side. The headline read, "A New Kind of Beginning." I folded the paper gently, placed it on the table, and sat down next to it. Not proud, just still. There are parts of me that still ache when I think of my son. Not because I want to return, but because I remember who I was when I believed he would never hurt me. That ache no longer runs the show. It's just a thread in the cloth, and the cloth keeps growing. Some days I still write letters I never send, but more often now I write things for others. Notes of encouragement, welcome letters to women applying to the fund, little reminders that beginnings come in quiet forms too. Sometimes all a woman needs is one open door, one chair pulled out, one moment of being seen without being asked to shrink. That's what this life has become, a space that doesn't ask me to earn it, just to live it. And I am, every day. If you've ever been told you were too old to start over or too late to matter, let this story remind you that no one gets to define your worth, but you. Share this with someone who may need to hear it today. And if you're walking through something silent and heavy, know that you are not alone. There is still space for your story to grow, quietly, boldly, in your own time.